Get started. It's amazing. For this production, I'm just I'll be guys watching places. All right. How do they want to I don't know. It's funny. Greeks had just enough. They knew how to like that. I mean, somebody knew that you had to agree. But then you know what I don't think the others. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I think we're going to get started because it's just a couple minutes after 6, and I know we're going to have so many questions and comments. It's going to be hard to cut us off at 7:30, so I want to maximize our time. Good evening, everyone. My name is Beth Folsom. I am the program manager at History Cambridge, and I am thrilled to welcome everybody here in the room with us, and also to the many folks who are joining us via Zoom. We have quite a large Zoom audience, and that I think is a testament to the excitement that people have about learning about the revolution and our wonderful speakers. So welcome to everybody. Before we get started, I would like to recognize that the space where we are tonight is located on the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize that land acknowledgement, while an important first step, does not absolve us of the communal responsibility of learning about the Indigenous history of this land and supporting the living Indigenous people who still inhabit the area today. There are many ways to engage in this learning, and we invite you to visit History Cambridge's Indigenous History Hub, located on our website, historycambridge.org, for more information and resources. There were many hands that helped to make this evening possible, and I would like to extend our thanks to the Cambridge 250 Committee, the Cambridge Public Library, the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, and the Cambridge Historical Commission. This is the first in a 7-part series, Washington and American Memory, which will run through April 2026 and is generously sponsored by a grant from Eastern National, a nonprofit partner organization of the National Park Service. So thank you to them for their support of this event. You can find information on the entire series on the library's website. You can we'll put this up again after, at the end of the program, we'll have this up, and the QR code right there takes you to register for the rest of the programs in our 7-part series. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. First, by a show of hands, how many of you live and or work in Cambridge? Love it. Okay. I'm actually gonna do this real quick and see if I can get my picture up because, hold on, sorry. I do have an image that I would love to share. And this is a quiz for you all. So for bonus points, can anyone tell me where this image is located? Yes, it is in Inman Square. Where? Yes, on the firehouse. Does anyone notice anything? Anyone who's not familiar with this image or maybe has kind of glanced at it but hasn't really looked too closely? I know the lighting is not the best. It's kind of bright in here, but is there anything you notice that kind of looks like it's maybe not one of these things is not like the other, or two of these things are not like the others? Yes. George Washington is over there on the left. Yeah. Anyone else? There's one more. Ben Franklin on the running board. Yes. So this is a mural that was painted during the bicentennial. As you can see over on the side, the marking there, it was painted in 76 and restored in 99. But it was meant to honor the firefighters of this particular East Cambridge firehouse. And so these would have been contemporaries or recently retired folks that were sort of the all-stars of their day in the 1970s. And then you get Ben and George sneaking in there because they were both volunteer firefighters in their own communities. And so this was a way to honor the local firefighting community and also tie it in with the bicentennial, because doesn't everybody want to be tied into the story of the revolution in some way? Doesn't every community kind of have that that secret or not so secret desire? And we'll talk a lot about that this evening. Okay. And when you came into the lecture hall this evening, you should have picked up two. Actually, I'm changing this because we decided to do it a little differently. One card, we're doing one card at the beginning and one card at the end. We have two questions that we're hoping folks will answer, if not to give back to us, just for your own kind of thought process and mulling over some of the things we're going to be talking about. The first question is, what are you hoping to learn in this series? Again, each of these lectures is very robust, and the discussion that will go with it is very robust on its own, but it is designed to be part of a 7-part series. So what are you hoping to learn from the series? And then the question that we'll give you at the end on your way out is, what is one thing that surprised you? At History Cambridge, we like to say that we use history as a tool for community building. And we've given you these questions as a way to jot down some of your thoughts about the evening, but also to be active participants in the conversation, both with tonight's speakers and with one another. We're curious what you came into the evening knowing, what you hope to learn, and if there's anything that surprised you. We will be collecting these cards at the end of the evening. We also invite you to share your questions and comments during the discussion part of the program. And for those on Zoom, we invite you to put your answers in the chat. Now, I am very pleased to introduce our speakers this evening. I'll introduce them both, and then Michael will speak first, and then Nikki. So Michael Hattem is an American historian with interests in early America, the American Revolution, and historical memory. He received his PhD in history at Yale University and has taught at the New School and Knox College. He's the author of The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, published by Yale University Press in 2024, which was a finalist for the 2025 George Washington Prize, and also passed in Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, which was published also by Yale University Press in 2020. He is currently the Associate Director of the Yale-New Haven Teachers Institute. Nikki Stewart currently serves as the Executive Director of Old North Illuminated, a role that blends her strategic leadership and fundraising expertise with her passion for connecting audiences to local history. Since 2020, Nikki has led the organization through a transformation that includes a new mission, an interpretive plan, extensive research into Old North's Black and Indigenous communities, and the creation of new on-site and classroom programming. Nikki previously served as the Vice President of Development at United South End Settlements. Nikki received a Juris Doctor and bachelor's degree from Northeastern University, and she is also the co-founder and sometimes host of the Hub History podcast, featuring 180 plus episodes on Boston history. And we are thrilled to have them both with us this evening. So please welcome them.
Allow me to switch the presentation if I can. Here we go.
Hold on. Sorry. Let's see.
Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Duplicate.
Here we go.
Okay. Sorry, where is it? Oh,
All right. Excellent. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, everyone, for coming. In my brief remarks tonight, I am going to touch on a question that was raised for me by working on this book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, which was, the book is essentially a history of how Americans have fought over the meaning and legacy of the revolution over nearly 250 years. But sort of one of the broader questions at the heart of the book has to do with why Americans have such a sort of unique emotional relationship to the revolution and to the memory of the revolution. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about that tonight. So the memory of the American Revolution is our national origin myth. And historians typically use the term myth in somewhat of a simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or a inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, and especially an origin myth, is a story that explains how a society or a people came to be. And often that story goes some way towards defining the character of that people or society. So to mythologize the revolution is not necessarily to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it. It's to tell the story of the revolution specifically in a way that it serves as the origins of the nation and of the nation's character, and also to set an agenda for the nation's future. Now, myths are first and foremost stories, and like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act has tended to focus on the coming of the revolution. We think about the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, all the way up to independence. The second act has typically featured the war and is organized around a timeline of major battles, if we think about Brooklyn and Saratoga and Yorktown. And then the third and final act typically recounts how in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And this way of telling the story gives it a sort of logical beginning, middle, and end. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the ways that Americans have told this basic story has followed a familiar form. This is the hero's journey. It's a sort of common narrative structure in Western mythology that was first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it's a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many hero myths. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and many others. And so I'm going to suggest to you that how Americans have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So at the start of the hero's journey, the hero, or in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. And after a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over its colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party, and this leads to the creation of a Continental Congress. Now, in these stories, typically the hero initially resists the call to adventure. And of course, throughout 1774 and 1775, Congress refused to consider independence and instead focused on trying to reconcile with Britain. But eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. And of course, in July 76, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. The hero then undergoes a series of challenges and temptations. And for the revolution, these challenges are represented by many of the war's battles. Often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor. Here we go. And later receives the timely aid of a helper. And of course, for the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And like the many times in mythical stories where the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's army and make the siege of Yorktown possible. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states. But as they quickly come to realize that the government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, the Constitution, and then they return to the known world, which is now changed for the better thanks to the hero's adventure. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us even when it's not explicit. Because we've been effectively culturally hardwired to in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses in us. And there's a real civic power that comes from individuals collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. And I would suggest that many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, particularly in their youth and particularly in the 19th century, have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. And this mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic mythical past, replete with heroes and villains and peril and daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world, if we think of Washington's retreat from Brooklyn. And this, I think, is in no small part why the revolution has been so central to our politics, our culture, and our national identity for the last 250 years. And we can actually see some correlations in terms of this emotional response if we look at a field called fandom studies, which is the study of how people and groups relate to stories and other facets of popular culture, how they express their emotional connections to those stories, and how those connections lead them to form or shape their personal identities and form communities around these connections to these stories. And so one of the ways that fans do this in fan culture is through conventions, annual events where people who share a love of stories or a specific story gather to discuss them and express their connections to them. And in some sense, Americans do the same for the American Revolution every July 4th, every time they visit places like Mount Vernon or Monticello or Independence Hall or the Boston Freedom Trail. Another way that fan cultures express their emotional connection to stories is by engaging in what's called cosplay, right? And where they dress up as their favorite characters. And of course, we have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles and moments like the crossing of the Delaware. And still another way that fans express these emotional connections to stories is through fan fiction, right? And there are whole websites devoted to stories written by fans using characters from Harry Potter or Star Wars or other franchises like that. And of course, we have done the same, through historical fiction. And then a fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art, where they create artwork featuring from their favorite stories, featuring characters they have a connection to. And we might think of Trumbull and Leitz's, artwork as a sort of fan art of the American Revolution. And then one final way that fans express their connections to stories is by visiting the recreations of the world of their stories, right? So if you're a Harry Potter fan, you can go to Universal Studios and visit Diagon Alley, or if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you can go to New Zealand and visit the Shire. And people visit them because they want to inhabit, right, the stories that they have deep emotional connections to. And of course, we do the same in a civic sense when people visit Colonial Williamsburg, the Boston Freedom Trail, or Independence National Historical Park. And so you can see that many of the ways that we have celebrated or commemorated the revolution have similarities to these fan cultures. And that's because we have often told the story of the revolution in a similar manner to the kinds of stories that prompt the creation of these fan cultures. And those are created when a story takes hold of people's imaginations and they establish such a deep emotional connection to those stories that they go on to form a part of their personal identity, and leads them to create a shared community around that emotional connection. And so at the heart, I think, of our relationship to the revolution really is something elemental about how we as human beings relate to these kinds of stories and the effects that they have on us. And I mean, I would suggest that part of the reason that we have this unique emotional connection to the memory of the revolution comes in no small part because it's an origin myth that we tell in the form of a hero myth, right? And that has all kinds of implications for thinking about American exceptionalism and many other things. But the broad point that I want to leave you with tonight is just about the deep importance of how we tell the story of the American Revolution. How we tell the story of the revolution matters, and that there are lots of choices that are made in deciding how to tell the story of the revolution. And my book is essentially a catalog of the many ways that we have told the story of the revolution and how those stories have changed over time. But it should give us some sense of agency as we come into this anniversary period to know that it's not just within our power, but in some sense part of our civic duty to tell the story of the revolution for ourselves and for our times.
Easier than I thought.
All right. So my name is Nikki Stewart. I'm the executive director at Old North Illuminated. We are the nonprofit that manages education, tourism, research, and preservation at Old North Church, which is located along the Freedom Trail and is part of Boston National Historical Park. So we are most known for the 2 by Sea lantern signal on the night of Paul Revere's ride. And when we talk about ourselves, we say, that is a moment that sparked the American Revolution. Historians may push back and say, well, it was one of many, but it is our claim to fame and we lean into it. And so at Old North, our 250, the 250th anniversary of the lantern signal, was this April. So we are essentially in our 250 year now, even though as a nation, we're gearing up for the semi-centennial next year. And so our planning for the 250 years, if I will, actually began back in 2020. So as we kind of moved through the pandemic in 2020 at Old North, we were fortunate to get a grant from the National Park Foundation that allowed us to do strategic planning and to think about how we would rebuild the organization from the financial losses of the pandemic and what we wanted our organization to look like by the 250 and how we wanted people to be able to enjoy the site and to learn its history. And so that process began with the very basic question of why do we teach history? And I think you can kind of connect that to the question of why do we celebrate the 250, right? What is this for? Is it to tell stories and like to tell myths and fairy tales, or do we study history because we are trying to understand the present and therefore trying to shape the future? And so for us at Old North, that was a very easy answer. And we are teaching the story of this place to influence that trajectory of past to present to future. And so one of the basic steps of that strategic plan was to articulate the mission statement that you see here, which is to inspire courageous and compassionate active citizenship by interpreting and preserving Old North Church. And so the first step that came out of that strategic plan was the development of an interpretive plan. And you can see here on the slide what the goals of our interpretive plan are. But for those of you who don't work in public history, you may wonder, what does that mean? And so an interpretive plan is essentially a blueprint for how we tell Old North's stories. Because even though we are most known for that one moment in 300 years of history, we have a lot more to tell. And by the pandemic, we had gotten to a point where we were telling, different stories from Old North's past, but they weren't being told in a connected way. And so we were really at risk of falling into a place of, okay, we talk about Paul Revere here, and we talk about the church's connection to enslavement over here. We're not even talking about Indigenous history yet. We're talking about women's history up in the gallery, and it's just not connecting into a great public experience. And so once we had our interpretive plan in place, and you can see, the goals that we articulated in the plan, have a purpose, right? And so when we think about how the 250 is being framed, the lens that people are viewing the American Revolution, I will be the first to say at Old North, we absolutely have a lens and a purpose. And I think on the slide here, you can see it's very clear what we're going for there. And so we looked at, after the interpretive plan, at a higher level, what do we want specifically for our interpretation of the revolution? Again, we have 300 years of history, 302 at this point. So for the revolutionary period, what are we looking at? And I will say, these bullet points aside, off the cuff, my biggest hope for our visitors who are coming through this year, next year, is that they will learn about the church's history in the revolutionary period and understand the very stark parallels between then and now. And particularly, folks are coming to Old North Church often thinking that Old North was a patriot conversation congregation, everybody is on the same team, and everybody is in agreement. And that is absolutely not true. Old North's congregation in the years leading up to the revolution was very much a divided community. Old North Church was a Church of England congregation, and so loyalty to the king is foundational to the spiritual beliefs of the congregation. And we say everybody was a loyalist until they decided that they were not. But by April of 1775, we think the best way to look at the congregation is to say a third remained loyalist, remained true to their faith as they interpreted it. About a third had turned to the Patriot cause. And this is a congregation that drew a lot of their wealth from the sea, from trade. And so we can understand how tariffs and port closures and things like that could have influenced their politics. But there is still about a third of the congregation that just does not want to talk about politics at Thanksgiving. And I think that's probably true to many churches today. And then also, this is a community that, even with its divides, had ties that bound them together. And after April 18th, 1775, when the rector resigns, the church closes for several years. And so this is also a group of people that have to move through a war, without their church, right? Without their community. And so we want to interpret the revolution in a way that allows people to see that the division, the hardship that we feel today is not new, and we can learn from those lessons of the past. So a few things, just to put it out there, that we did to prepare for the 250. So we started with a research fellowship. In the early and mid 18th century, Old North had a very racially diverse congregation. I want to be clear that it was not a place of equality. It was very much a place of white supremacy, and yet it was incredibly diverse. And those stories have been hard to find in the church's archives. And so we created a year-long full-time research fellowship with Dr. Jamie Crumley at the University of Utah to go through the church's archives and pull out the stories and the lessons that we could begin to tell from that part of the church's history. That information is wonderful to have, but is really only useful once you start conveying it to people. And so it informed new exhibits, new classroom programming, a play that we commissioned for our 300th anniversary in 2023 called Revolution's Edge. And it's very much a part of all of the interpreting that we are doing at the church today. Another way, I think a more fun way, well, I guess it's fun for me, a fun way that we prepared for the 250 is to restore a little bit of the space to what the congregation at that time would have recognized. Old North Church was whitewashed in 1912, but up until that point, it had had a very richly decorated interior. And so last year, in addition to new programming and research, we also restored 20 murals of angels in the church's sanctuary. So when people visit us today, we say it's a little bit, it's a glimpse of the church, of course, as Paul Revere would have known it. And then I also want to talk just another moment, I know I'm almost out of time, about how we celebrated on April 18th of 2025, which again is our 250th. So we celebrated with a table reading of our play, Revolution's Edge. And I think this play really demonstrates how we want people to engage with the revolution. The play has three characters: Reverend Mather Biles, who is the church's rector at the time, Captain John Pulling, who was one of the lantern bearers, and then Cato, an African man who was enslaved by Mather Biles. And this is a story that I think really takes historical figures, the heroes of the past, off of their pedestal. When we thought about Revere's Ride and the lantern bearers and all of that, we saw people who stepped forward because they had made commitments to their neighbors, commitments to their communities, and people who took great risk at risk of very serious consequences to themselves. I remember thinking as I was here on the Prado waiting for the Revere reenactor to walk by, that he left his home that night. He said goodbye to his children, he kissed his wife, not knowing if he was going to come back. And I think that is, the courageous and compassionate leadership that we hope to inspire. And I think this is the second time I've hit that. I think I will leave it there and we'll go to discussion.
You all hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you both so much. I have a whole long list of discussion questions that I would love to hear you all talk about, but I'm going to limit myself because I would love to hear from our audience, both in the room and also online. But I will start by saying you've both addressed the idea of national kind of myth making and putting ourselves in the national story. And I'm wondering how you see the relationship, if it's one of tension or it's complementary, between having a national celebration like the 250th and really having a focus on local history and how various cities, towns, even states have played into the national story. And I'm particularly interested. We're in an area where that dovetails very nicely and very neatly. But how does that play out in parts of what is now the United States that were not directly involved in that revolutionary story? So just anything you kind of want to share about the balance between a national story and a local story.
So I was very interested in that question when I was working on the book because especially for the Midwest and the Western parts of the United States and trying to think about how people in those places came to develop memories of the revolution because of their geographic remove from the sites of the revolution. For people who grow up in the Northeast, it's kind of around us and it's a tangible thing, but for people in the Midwest and the West was much less tangible. And so one of the ways that I tried to get at that was by looking at the various tours that the Liberty Bell did after the Civil War in the decades after, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And part of that was as an effort to stitch the country back together after the Civil Wars. And so the Liberty Bell went on several tours of the South, went all the way down to New Orleans, several other places. And I have a chapter in the book that covers its sort of last tour, which was in 1915 to the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. It's sort of like a West Coast World's Fair. And the Liberty Bell is put on a special train called the Liberty Special, where it's mounted on a sort of open train car and illuminated. And it went from Philadelphia all the way through the Midwest up to Washington State and then down the coast to San Francisco, where it stayed for a few months as part of the exposition and they say it was the most photographed object at the exposition. And then on its return, it came through the Southwest and the Deep South. And we have pictures, images of people, because the train would make stops in various towns, cities and towns. We have lots of pictures of that. People waiting online to go up and kiss the Liberty Bell, In Texas, young African-American girl did that, and it nearly set off a race riot, which was reported widely in African-American newspapers. But so the idea of the bell going on this tour is it's a moment where the revolution can become tangible to people in these, in the Midwest, in the Northwest, on the West Coast. And that seems to have been a really meaningful event for lots of communities. I mean, there's stories in some Midwestern newspapers of, people walking miles to just to be able to see the train go by, not even stop, right? And so that's one of these moments where these communities outside of the Northeast or just the East Coast generally, had a chance to have some kind of tangible relationship with the memory of the revolution, and they took it. And lots of historical societies throughout the Midwest and the West have pictures from when the Liberty Bell stopped in their town. So it was a really meaningful event.
I think probably every historic site in the country is thinking about how they can tap into the 250, right? Like everybody wants both the tourism and the opportunity to educate. And so I think there are also, themes that historic sites are looking at. I think there's a question of, well, what does revolution mean, right? What does it mean in the context of the American Revolution? But what does it mean for the Haitian Revolution? Was the Civil War a revolution, right? I think that, especially in other parts of the country, that's an angle into it. And I think also it begs the question of, what does it mean to be an American? Like, how has the American identity changed over time? Because the revolution is, kind of when you can point to that concept beginning. So I think, I feel lucky to be at Old North Church because my tie was right there. I didn't have to work for it. I know my colleagues in other places are. But I think it's exciting to see how those 250 celebrations are going to be different region to region.
One of the interesting things about the centennial in 1876, and then again the bicentennial in 1976, was that they, in a lot of cases, and especially in the Midwest and the West, they ended up spurring much more interest in local history than in the history of the revolution, right? So in 76, Grant issues an executive order that calls on all towns and counties to produce a history of their town or county for this centennial. And that is done in many places. And during the bicentennial in 1976, a lot of the federal funding went to local historical societies, local organizations, and for projects that were about, that were focused on local history. And so all of our anniversaries have tended to spur, work on and interest in local history.
A great segue into my next question, which is, so we've centered at least the publicity and the title of this series on George Washington, right? And we like to think that we're using Washington as a recognizable entry point to a much broader discussion. But what do you all think about the idea of choosing, a kind of singular character or a story, an incident in the revolutionary story? Do you feel that can be a good entry point, or do you feel that sort of obscures the more complex histories that we are now collectively trying to tell? How does the great man myth, I guess, play out as far as diversifying the context of the revolution and the lived experiences of people? Is it helpful? Is it harmful? Is it a combination of both? It's a big question, sorry.
Well, I come at it with the lens of two lanterns. So, we're also coming in with a narrow lens. Because that's a title, that's a headline, that's a soundbite, right? I think the American Revolution is so big. I don't know I mean, maybe one person is too small. Again, the lanterns were hung for 1 minute. Maybe that's too small. But I think it's better to have an entry point and to think about, okay, but what are the themes? How do you broaden it out from there? How do I start with the lantern signals, but then get people talking about Abigail Adams, right? My one figure from the Revolution. I think Abigail to me is George Washington to many.
I mean, no single institution could possibly have any pretense to encompassing the entire revolution, right? And that's as it should be, because the revolution is too complex an event for that to be possible. In terms of the founders, I mean,
Can you speak into the microphone?
sorry. In terms of the founders, I guess specifically, they've been part of the changes that have occurred in terms of how we have discussed, and thought about the memory of the revolution. Individual founders' reputations change over time, right? So they're not all held in high regard at all times. And I think, in a lot of ways that history is really instructive. And I think it's really helpful to understand that. It's also just in terms of, pure history, it's worth reminding people that in the 1790s, George Washington was not a widely appreciated figure by most of the country, right? But of course, following his death in 1799, that's when he's sort of cemented as the sort of father of the country, right? So I think there's still complexity to be had in, even if you take the entryway of a specific founder, there's still a lot of complexity to be had there.
Another thought that I had when I was kind of mulling all of this over was the impact of living memory and how commemorations change when there are no longer people alive that have witnessed these events. And I'm curious to know, your thoughts on that. One of the, I was going to say a branch off of that, and no pun intended, but now that I've said it, pun intended. One of our, of course, enduring symbols here in Cambridge is the Washington elm. And for those of you who may not know, the myth is that Washington took command of the American Army on Cambridge Common. That's not a myth. But under this particular elm tree that supposedly sprouted in the 17 teens and was a living part of that landscape. We know now that it was actually not the original tree that persisted for that long, but we have it, made its way to the Cambridge City Seal. It's a very important mythic part of our city's past. And I have gone back and read newspaper accounts. There was a tremendous amount of money and time and effort spent into resuscitating this tree that was on its last legs for so long. And people would, people would be riding down the street in their carriage and a branch would fall off and hit somebody and injure them. And then people would run out into the street and scoop up the wood. And, it was really this amazing concept, but there's something different about that as a holder of living memory. And so what is it, whether it's a person, a tree, what is it that's so special about having a living memory of an event, and how does it change when those folks are gone? Does it make it harder to tell the story? Does it make it in some ways easier to tell the story? Yeah, I'd just love to hear what you all think about that.
I think it makes it easier to tell the story because it makes it easier to be critical, right? And there are things that are then lost, and there are things you'll never get to ask, that you'll never get to know. But it does allow you to really analyze. And I think now, it's kind of tricky now because we are so far from the revolution. We are 250 years out. But there are still descendants. There are still like the DAR, the SAR societies like that. At Old North, there are a lot of Newman and Revere descendants, I can say. But I think it allows us to unpack the history as it was. And the further we get, I think the less protection there is for the myths, an opportunity to bring in the nuance.
I mean, there's another side to that, and this, I mean, so in the 18 teens, 1820s, especially as the Jubilee is coming, that's the 50th anniversary. There's a real growing sense of anxiety on the part of a lot of people that the revolutionary generation is dying off, right? And that pretty soon, there would be no real living connection to the revolution. And we had sources where people describing that as that would be the moment when the revolution passes into history, right? As opposed to being something that was still tangible. And I think we can relate to that. I think in the present, for example, as the generation that experienced the Holocaust is dying off. And what is happening with that is somewhat similar to what happens to the memory of the revolution in the 1830s and 1840s and then just beyond, which is that in some sense allows the memory of the revolution or whatever event to become much more malleable, right? So yes, you can then maybe be a little bit more honest about or critical of things that happen, but also allows for lots of changes to the memory of that event that are not necessarily positive, right? And so I think it's a double-edged sword, and I think it's something that we can appreciate in the present, the anxiety that comes with that moment of an event passing into history.
So going along with that, I had a question about sources, and I'm wondering what each of you sees as kind of new or traditionally underutilized source bases for doing this kind of work, and how opening up and exploring new kinds of sources and also reading more traditional sources in different new ways has played into how we view the revolution. So what have been some, Nikki, you talked about, especially your research fellow going into the archives and pulling things out, and Michael with your book research, what have you found that is different maybe than the sources that folks used at the bicentennial? What are you seeing now, and how is it shifting the types of stories we're able to tell about the revolution?
I mean, for me specifically as a traditionally 18th century historian, my experience working on this book was interesting because the book covers mostly the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think that the thing that was most striking to me, just personally as a researcher, was the amount and type of sources that 20th century historians have relative to 18th century historians. And so some of the things that I was able to look at to try to get at the ways that the revolution was depicted in our political culture and our popular culture, was things like silent films and early films. I found lots of newsreel footage. So for example, there is available newsreel footage of the Liberty Bell in California in 1915. I was able to look at radio programs, right, and transcripts of radio programs, television programs. I talk in the book about this one of Walter Cronkite's first television programs, which was called "You Are There," and it was a sort of reenactment kind of news broadcast for many events. And of course, he did the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And so there was just like a lot. I had a lot more sources than I think the sort of last major book that tried to look at the memory of the revolution long term was from the bicentennial era, and it was much more limited in its scope and its source base. And so I think I had access to much more sources that were more easily available to me in the internet era than they would have been to a historian in 1976.
For our research, we've been blessed with generally pretty good records because the church took meticulous records of anything that cost money or earned money. And so that includes a lot. But the challenge is that that doesn't really include the lives and experiences of the church's Black and Indigenous congregants. And so, when we began working with our research fellow a few years ago, she was working with the records that had been there for always, right? That everyone before her had worked with. But I think she came in, first of all, with a different purpose that allowed her to look at things, to look for different details, right? And to think about how to put those details together. And it required stringing together lots of resources, right? Because maybe there was a record of a wedding of two Black congregants. And if she was lucky, there were first names and last names for both of them. But that might be all that appeared in the church's records. So she then had to, travel to multiple places, and really try to pull out what she could. And I think it raised the question of, to what extent can you make inferences? To what extent can you make educated guesses? And then how do you convey that in the interpretation, right? Because if you're making an inference, you can't present it as fact, but you might get to a point where you can see that something is very, very likely. What are the ethics of that? And how do you convey that in a way that lets people still trust us as a reputable source? And so, we were fortunate to have a researcher who was just really so experienced in this arena already.
So, one of my undergraduate mentors was Carol Birkin, who was a sort of pioneering women's historian in the 1970s, so women's history of early America, and she used to tell me about going into the archives as someone who was looking to uncover women's history, and the way that historical societies and archives had cataloged collections that had come in all throughout the 19th century, lots of things went sort of uncategorized in finding aids and things like that. So if there was, a shipping or business account book, that would be included, right? But if there was a woman's diary, that usually would not be included in the finding aid, right? And so it made it it made it quite difficult for that first generation of women's historians in the 1970s to do that work. But their work led to a real change in how archivists and historical societies treat those collections. And so one of the big differences between the bicentennial and now in trying to do that history is, again, there is so much more that's widely available and that is seen as valuable in an archival context. So it really, the last 50 years has significantly changed what our archives look like.
One of the ways we do this, I think specifically about women's history, I think just as an example of how you might try to pull that out where it otherwise might not be, is, we do an exercise with field trips where we look at historical recipes. Old North has a lot of connections to the cacao trade in the colonial era. And so we'll look at a recipe for how to make a drinking chocolate, which is very different than what we would drink as hot chocolate today, right? It has a lot of spices in it, and you have to really prepare it from scratch. So we might look at the recipe and say, well, who in the household do you think was doing this, right? Like, okay, so you have to heat the water. How would that happen? Wow, like that seems like that's a little dangerous. You could really get hurt in the kitchen. Who do you think was grinding the sugar? Oh, this is very labor intensive. Like, who do you think would have time to do this kind of work? And so, we're not making statements, but I think in the asking of questions, you can tell stories as well.
That's so interesting because when you're talking about inferences, probably the single biggest inference that traditionally historians have made is believing that because something is written down, that it is factual. And so to me, the idea of using your imagination and your powers of deduction to really kind of connect two things that seem very close together doesn't seem any more unbelievable or unreliable than going by the fact that if it is a written source, it is factual. So that's such an interesting kind of spin on it. But I have so much more that I'd love to ask, but I'm going to end my portion with one last question that I would love to open it up to folks who might want to share a comment or question. But my last question to both of you is, what do we need from the 250th? And that is not prescriptive. You all do not have to solve the nation's problems with this answer, but I'm very curious if you could kind of distill what you see the role of the memory of the revolution at this point in our national life. What do you think could help us? What are you afraid will not help us? How do you see it?
I think on a basic level, I hope that everyone can find things to feel proud of and things to find joy in as we celebrate the 250. And you know, I come from this in a place of despair where I think it's horrible where we're at the 250, but it is also an opportunity to reflect on how far we've come. And I hope that more people can see themselves in that story and feel like to feel ownership of over the revolution. And, you know, maybe your family wasn't in the colonies at that time, or maybe for other reasons you feel disconnected from the history. But I hope that the 250 programming plays out in a way where everyone can start to feel pride in what it means to be a US citizen today. And I'm not, you know, foolish enough to think that we will get to a point of like really having a common identity as Americans. But I hope that we all find it for ourselves.
I think that one of the lessons from my book, or one of the takeaways from my book, is that that we have constantly redefined the American Revolution, that we have redefined ideas and principles that we attribute to the revolution. The book especially sort of has a thread of the changing ways that we have defined liberty and equality, and especially the relationship between the two. But I think that the 250 can be valuable if and it should provide a civic opportunity, right, for us as individuals, as communities, as a nation, to think about what the revolution and what its sort of first principles mean for us now in the present, right? So what does liberty mean for us now in our contemporary context, right? All generations past of Americans have redefined those terms: liberty, equality, tyranny, for that matter, right? And so it's sort of incumbent on us to do the same. And I think it's actually it's a potentially really valuable civic opportunity for us to reflect on those ideals and decide really what they should mean for us in our current moment.
Thank you both so much. This has been wonderful. I would love to open the floor to questions, comments. I think we'll start here in the audience, in the live audience, and then go to some folks online. So raise your hand up high, and Marika will come to you with the microphone.
So first, thanks to you both. This is really interesting. I thought the idea of local history, like the bicentennial people celebrate their local history was very interesting. I'm from Oklahoma, and one of the lasting ways that my town celebrated the bicentennial was they bought a train car from the 1910s, which was important to how the town was founded. So that was interesting. Um, my question is, in the idea of translating the revolution into the hero's journey, do you think there's a particular or a biggest historical misconception? Like, what was the thing they had to fudge the most to fit it into the hero's journey idea?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't know if like it's a very loose, in some sense, chronology. That's what the hero's journey is, right? So I mean, you could argue about any one of those points and how they fit necessarily, but I think the broader point is that even within that, using that structure, right? You can still tell the revolution in many, many ways that changes its meaning or even subtly shifts its meaning, right? They're, just changing the start date of when you think the revolution started has a significant impact on on what the narrative or the meaning of the revolution seems to be, right? If it's 1765, you're talking about the Stamp Act, and then it seems like a political, legislative kind of thing, right? If it's 1775, like many people in the 18th century thought it was, then it's a more military driven narrative, right? And the same goes for when you think the end of the revolution is it 1783 with the treaty? Then that's also a more sort of military driven narrative. Is it 1787? Is it 1800 for that matter? So even within that structure, you have there are lots and lots of choices to be made, not just in chronology, but also in who gets included in parts of those stories and who gets excluded, right? So there's lots of choices that get made even within, that structure that can have significant impacts on the story of the revolution that you are trying to convey.
And I think going along with that, the idea that, there's two very different documents that kind of bookmark what we think of the traditional revolutionary era, right? There's the Declaration of Independence, and then there's the Constitution. And depending on which one you center as your political document, completely changes not only what you experienced during the time, but how that's viewed, who claims the Declaration, which is, we're in the Declaration anniversary right now, coming up on it next year. But if you claim the Constitution, it's a whole other ball of wax, right? In how you frame the entire narrative and your relationship to it. So
I will also just say, I think maybe this is a little bit of a further back response, but I think for our interpretation at Old North, what we're really trying to undo from the hero's journey is the placement of the loyalist as the villain in the story. Because I think when we look at the stories of our congregants, right, like it seems pretty reasonable, or at least the loyalist perspective is not unreasonable. And I think we really tried to make that clear in the dialogue of our play, where you really, at the end of the day, it is two fathers having a conversation about the fears that they have for their future and their families. And they are looking at the same set of circumstances and just making different decisions about what the safest route is. And I think we've really fallen into a narrative of, patriots good, loyalists bad, and it's harmful for how we see each other today.
I was also really intrigued by the idea of fitting our history into the hero's journey. Do you think the United States is unique in the way that we often do that, or have you seen that in other countries as well? And if so, why? What might we be unique?
I've been asked that question often, and I have not studied other countries in the sense of telling their national story. That said, I mean, I do think there is something unique about it. I don't want to say exceptional necessarily, But there is something different about the connection that we have to the revolution. Lots of the ways that I showed us commemorating the revolution are not necessarily common in lots of other countries for what they might think of as their founding moments. Our story is also a little bit different, at least in relationship to Europe, because it is recent. It's recent and it's part of the recorded past. And in some sense, the revolution was so recorded. That's another thing that makes it very malleable, right? It's that we have so many sources from the period. So I can't say definitively that it's entirely unique, but I think that there is something a bit unique about our relationship to the revolution, or if not unique, then let's say different.
It's your methods of finding sources are pretty unique to, I guess, the time period. But it seems like going forward, AI and the internet and fake news and things like that are going to be making it much more difficult for historians to come up with narratives that resemble reality. I'm just wondering, do you see some kind of rewriting of history that might possibly occur based on what's happening now? Or how do how do you see your research methods changing in the future?
That's a fascinating question. AI is a perplexing issue for many of us involved in history education or humanities education generally. One of the things I have worried about up until this point more than AI is the access that historians will have to personal correspondence, right? We rely on that so heavily as 18th century historians and even 19th century historians. Who is going to be able to access people's emails, right? Or their email accounts, or social media accounts, are those, and the preservation of those things is very much in question. So there will undoubtedly be changes in historical methods, but that's been the case throughout, really the practice of history as an academic discipline. The creation of microfilm was sort of a radical development in the study of early American history in the 1950s. And so there's always going to be significant changes like that create changes in how historians do their work. There are other questions about whether there will still be historians in the future that's a whole other set of questions. But as a historian now, I do wonder that same question about what is it going to look like down the road.
The National Archives has a little ad campaign on social media, and it says, is reading cursive your superpower? And they are asking for volunteers to help transcribe the revolutionary pension records that are in cursive. And I shudder when I look at my 13-year-old son's handwriting that did not have any kind of cursive or penmanship in school. But though that access to those sources eventually may be quite limited unless everything is digitized and transcribed. I think the ability to just go into an archive and read things in the original format, I think, is also something that, it's scary to think that might not be widely possible for a lot of folks in, a generation or two.
I can ask a question because I'm holding the microphone. Nikki, I'm curious what your visitorship is interested in. What kind of questions do they ask? And has that changed over time?
Yeah, so we did an audience research study in 2021, really before we made big investments in our programming. And it gave us a lot of useful data. I think the thing that was most shocking to us, and I think you all will be shocked as well, is that really about half of the folks arriving at the church and considering buying a ticket didn't know why Old North Church was famous, right? They know it's on the Freedom Trail. They know there's something. But they didn't know that this was the site of the lantern signals on the night of Paul Revere's ride. And so, to some extent, I think that means that half of our visitors are coming with pretty open minds. The other thing that we learned through that study is that about 30% of our visitors were actively interested in Black and Indigenous history, which was very encouraging for us, and it allowed us to go to funders and say, look, see, there's interest, right? This is worth investing in. And it didn't mean that the other 70% were hostile to. I mean, some of them were, I'm sure, but some were neutral. But I think what we see today, by and large, is that folks are coming in because of the lantern story, because of Revere's ride, but they seem to be very open to the other things that we have to tell. And again, we've tried to be very intentional about weaving the history together so that it makes sense as a cohesive story. And I think we've also tried to be intentional about doing our interpretation in a way that allows people to find what they're looking for and to some extent allows them to bypass what they're not looking for. And that's a difficult thing to strike, but I think we've done a pretty good job.
Thank you both for your very interesting remarks and also yours as well, Beth, your questions. I'm curious at both the Old North Church and in any general recollection of our revolution over the decades, bicentennial, centennial, and whatever the 50th anniversary of the revolution would have been. How have political movements or ideas of the time sort of grabbed onto maybe the story of the Old North Church, events of the Old North Church or surroundings, or the revolution at large? And I'm sort of thinking about this because I was surprised, I suppose maybe about 10 years ago, seeing the back of a cousin's cell phone with a "Don't Tread on Me" flag there, which went with some evolving politics of his. And he was claiming something there before I realized that it was up for grabs by either side. So that's my question. Sorry if I blubbered it out.
So I think what's really interesting about Old North is that it seems that Old North Church is beloved by people all the way across the political spectrum. And I think that makes the church exceptionally special. In some ways, it makes our job easy, and in some ways, it makes it hard because people are coming in with very different viewpoints and expectations. But you mentioned the sticker, so I'll give one anecdote. Earlier this year, actually for the anniversary on April 18th, we produced a new T-shirt that all it says is resistance, and it has two lanterns beneath that. And there was some debate about, well, is that a political statement? And it's like, well, we do see the lantern signal as, one of America's greatest acts of resistance. And so after moving through multiple color options, the T-shirt is now available in blue and in red. And both colors sell equally, and nobody really snarks about it because as long as they can get it in their color, they see themselves in it. And it's shocking. I mean, first we had it in green and well, that was neutral. But I think it's actually better having it in the red and the blue. And it's truly shocking to me that they both sell, and folks are happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the sort of narrative thread in my book, which is just how widely across the political spectrum the memory of the revolution has been used. So from abolitionists to pro-slavery Confederates, from conservative anti-communists to the Communist Party of the United States itself. I have a whole bit in the book about how they adopted the revolution during the Popular Front era of the 1930s and 1940s. So it's always been able to be used across the political spectrum, and that's partly because it's so malleable, and part of that is this sort of fact that we have these two fundamentally different founding documents. And a lot of times I talk in the book about how there's almost a sort of contest between the Declaration and the Constitution for which one is the defining document of the revolution. And that's a thread that plays out, for a long period in American history. So it's and those anniversaries are always affected by the contemporary politics of the time. The centennial was deeply affected by the end, by being in the post-Civil War period, the end of Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Panic of 1873 and that economic downturn, and the labor issues that are emerging in the 1870s, right? And the bicentennial was, has a lot of similarities to the present, right? You have presidential scandals going on, right? The economic downturn of the early 1970s, then like the energy crisis of the early 1970s, the unprecedented levels of distrust in American institutions in the 1970s, right? So there are lots of similarities between the centennial and the bicentennial and the present. And it's just how we look at the revolution, whether it's an anniversary or not, is always shaped by our present. That's basically the statement of the book. But it's sort of more so, I think, during the anniversaries. And I found that in the book that there are certain conditions that lead to more sort of intense fighting over the memory of the revolution. And one of those is, high levels of political partisanship, at times of high partisanship, in times of an economic downturn, in times of increased immigration or perceived increases in immigration. And then also an upcoming anniversary happens to be one of those conditions. So in some sense, we're kind of we're heading for a sort of perfect storm of all of those conditions for the 250, and it's going to make, I think, it's going to tend to raise the stakes around the anniversary much higher than they would typically otherwise be.
I'd love to hear if we have any questions from our online viewers. Alyssa, I don't know if you have anything on there that you could share.
I do. I'm just going to read this verbatim. Something I drew from Hattem's book is how many of these major anniversary years were happening around times of significant division in the nation. Centennial, not too long after Civil War, and bicentennial in the midst of the Vietnam War, tearing the nation apart. What opportunity can addressing the history of revolutionary celebrations provide these historic sites, given the current state of politics and society? Do public historians have a responsibility to tell not only the American Revolution for our times, but also address that this is not necessarily something, quote unquote, new?
I mean, I think yes. I think, for us at Old North, at least, that goes back to, the answer to the question, why do we teach history? And it is not just to tell nice stories, right? It is to make those connections And one way that we tackle that in our interpretation, in a way that I don't think feels political, is we talk about Longfellow's poem, because Old North Church, for much of its history, was not a historic site; it was a church. And it's really not until Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, is published in 1860 that people start to remember the lantern signal and to really look to that as a significant action. And that's really intentional, because Longfellow writes the poem to rally support for the Union cause. And it's not a factual account, right? Like, it's very much artistic license on the story of Revere and the Midnight Ride. And he is trying to remind his readers that not too long ago, their ancestors had united against a common foe. And so I think when we tell that story, right, that today, that's a story about something that happened in 1860. But it helps people make the connection about maybe who's telling stories today and what their angles are. So I think none of this is new. And I hope that's reassuring for our visitors.
Yeah, I think there's a tangible value in people recognizing that certain things aren't new, and especially in terms when it comes to fighting over the revolution. So, like, for example, I sort of I talk about one of the very first textbook controversies, which was in 1920 in New York City, and had largely to do with how the revolution was treated in those textbooks. And that ever since has become a sort of recurring theme in American politics. Every 20 years or so, typically conservatives, roll out a new textbook controversy, right? And every time it seems like the rhetoric around it is framed as an unprecedented attack on our national history, right?
It was very precedented.
Yeah, but when you talk about it that way, it raises the stakes, right? The perceived stakes, and lots of people who don't know that this is a common occurrence, throughout our history, sort of internalize that idea, like, oh my God, this is an unprecedented threat, right? And it just dials up the stakes. And I think, the more that the better understanding that we have that these types of ways of remembering the revolution or fighting of them, have lots of precedents, can help to sort of dial down the sense of the stakes. And I think that that's a good thing in our current content.
Yeah, just to add really quickly that I don't think it's a coincidence that Nikki, you started at Old North Illuminated in 2020, and I feel like a lot of what we've been talking about since the beginning of the pandemic has been looking for stories of resilience, looking for stories of challenge and overcoming that challenge. And it feels like this is definitely a moment when that resilience is a really crucial tool for us as on the local level, as well as on the national level. And so learning those lessons that people have been through this and much worse before, I think is very valuable right now. We are heading towards 7:30. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Alyssa, are there other online ones, or should we try to get somebody from oh, we have a hand. Yes.
Thank you. I have like a kind of like from my recent visit in Atlanta and Montgomery, building for the culture of remembrance experience from my recent trip. My question is, how can the social enterprise integrate culture of remembrance into like business model in a way that not only for honor the past, but also actively shape the more ethical and inclusive future?
The big question.
Yeah. Very important, but very okay. That brings up an interesting point about the role of immigrants in the continuing revolutionary story, right? Like we see so many examples of folks who are new to the country really taking the revolutionary story to heart and living into it and placing themselves in that story. And how do we capitalize on that and really provide a space for people who they themselves and their families were not part of the revolutionary experience in this country? How do we see immigrants as part of that narrative?
Yeah, that's been a recurring theme also throughout the history of the memory of the revolution, especially, so lots of conflicts here in Boston about, the role of the Irish in the centennial, and raising questions about who can lay claim to the memory of the revolution, right? And I tend to think that one of the ways that I sort of think about the idea of cultural citizenship is that you can lay claim to the memory of the revolution in some way, right? And so one of the ways that we have seen that try to be denied people is by trying to deny their ability to lay claim to the memory of the revolution, whether it's the Irish during the centennial era here, groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution were founded in the 1890s in a time of unprecedented immigration, right, from Southern and Eastern Europe. And a big part of their founding mission was to educate these immigrants in the proper ideas of Americanism and the proper meaning of the American Revolution. And we continue to see that, all the way through this, through the first half of the 20th century. Those groups are still doing that kind of work. They kind of morph into anti-communist groups in that period, which is its own history. But this idea of trying to deny, especially immigrant populations, the ability to see themselves or feel themselves as a part of the legacy of the revolution is a recurring theme, unfortunately.
I think it's also, the question leads to an opportunity to acknowledge that the revolution isn't the only chapter in our nation's history, right? And it's not the only chapter that makes our country what it is today. I think at a basic level, there are a lot of stories of immigrants in the revolution, but it's European immigrants, right? So it's like, how do we get to a place where folks who have immigrated from other places, feel ownership over a shared national history? And I think it has to be okay if folks don't find that in the revolution, but maybe they find that in the next chapter.
I mean, I would say when I was talking before about, the hope that people would take the 250 as an opportunity to rethink the meaning of these ideals and to have conversations around them, that's the kind of process that, that can make somebody feel a part of the legacy of the revolution. It doesn't necessarily have to be that their ancestors were there or even that people that look like them were necessarily there. But the fact that once you start debating what liberty and equality means or what tyranny means, that makes you a part of the legacy of the revolution.
We have reached the end of our time together, unfortunately, but I want to thank Michael and Nikki so much for sharing these insights. I want to thank all of you, whether you're here with us in person or you're joining us online. Thank you for the great questions and comments and for your engagement. I'm going to put up on the screen once again the QR code for registering for the other lectures and discussions in this series. And we really hope that you all can kind of see this as a journey that we're all going to go on together from now till April. And I just want to thank everybody here at the library, the other folks and other organizations that were instrumental in helping us plan this. And we're very, very excited to continue the conversation. We do have a second card that I mentioned, a second question card on your way out. It's what surprised you. We would love it if you would share these with us. If you feel like you need to hold it close to your heart, that is okay. Sleep with it under your pillow and ruminate on it. We also have some cookies out there. We're not gatekeeping, so you do not need to give us a card to get your cookie, but we hope you will consider it anyway. So thank you all so much. Oh, yes, I can